Hello. Today I'm going to give a talk on step one of the 12 steps originally found in Alcoholics Anonymous. You might be thinking right now, well, this dude doesn't have any concern for traditions. And you might notice that I never actually said I'm a member of Alcoholics Anonymous. I just mentioned that that's where these steps originally came from. And I will talk about one of them. Since then, the 12 steps have been used in many different capacities, going beyond substance addictions to process addictions, compulsive working, eating disorders, all sorts of things. They're a very useful set of tools for changing one's life. So the first step, for anyone not familiar, and for those of you who are, is we admitted we were powerless over whatever, and our lives had become unmanageable. Often the principle that's associated with this step is acceptance, although if you look, you'll find many principles associated with each of the steps. So it's really hard to pin down just one, and although some people will be adamant that there is one. But acceptance makes sense to me as there's a marked distinction between admitting and accepting, which I find really key. You know, a lot of people can admit, oh, sure, I have a problem. But when one accepts a problem, that suggests a deeper understanding and then some amends in our actions. You know, if I accept that this is killing me, if I truly accept it, then I'm a lot more likely to take some action to the contrary. So a question often associated with step one, or maybe not often, is what are my limits? And that'll bring me to my first encounter with the steps. When I first encountered step one and began to take a look at it seriously, was due to pretty heavy drug use. I really liked crystal meth. I really liked to drink booze, vodka and gin and things like this. But I wasn't very choosy. You know, I would do any kind of drugs that were in front of me. If I couldn't find meth, I would have done whatever was available, and did. But that's the thing that brought me to in touch with the steps. And you know, I was kind of at that place when I first encountered them that I could admit this, but I couldn't quite accept it. And as a consequence, it took me a lot more suffering to really start to change my life. I first encountered the steps when I was 20 years old. It took me till I was about 25 till I made an honest effort at using them to change my life. And you know, by then even I'd started to realize that I had some other limits besides just the drugs in my life. You know, I realized that I had some troubles with relationships with people, with romantic partners especially. I would obsess and, you know, even like some what could be described as some stalker behaviors in some cases when I was very obsessed. And you know, my relationship with pornography was out of control. My relationship with food had been pretty out of control since I was a young kid. When I was a young child, I was 220 pounds by the time I was 11 years old, and not an athletic kid at all by any means. You know, just sugar on top of sugar and no exercise. So I had to sort out a few of these limits, and I wasn't able to articulate them or know what they were at first. But these started to reveal themselves through the process of the steps. So, anyways, the step itself, powerless and unmanageable. You know, these are the two ideas here, and there is a lot of discourse as to whether people really are powerless over addictions or not in various circles. You know, like, and that can cause a lot of pushback from people, like, no, I'm not powerless. I have the power. And that might be so. I'm not here to tell you one way or the other that you are, in fact, powerless if you have an addiction. I know for myself, it has seemed as such in cases where once I surrendered to the addiction, to choosing to go down that path, I truly felt, and I might even say believe, that I lost the power of choice. There was power of choice to that point, is what it seems like to me. But once I was on the way to my dealer's house to pick up meth, my body was in control now, and that addiction had taken over. Like, it was now in charge. The person who is what I would say like my deeper self, I couldn't find that person anymore. It's buried. So that's my experience with it. And aside from that's kind of semantics, is powerless or powerless not. I think what's often more helpful, if that is a problem, is the unmanageability piece. Because, if I considered how my life looked when I was using dope, and I haven't for some time now, it's been 10 years at this recording, but when I did use dope, I was, by the end I couldn't work a job. I was I was overdosing regularly, and like every time I went on a run, it would be either I would end up in the hospital either on day 1, day 3, day 8. It was inevitable. Just the timeline differed. Couldn't work a job. People didn't really like being around me because I was so sketchy, and I would just go shoot, inject drugs in their bathrooms, and they didn't like it, or in their kitchen. They didn't like that either. Even amongst drug users, I was kind of starting to become ostracized. Most of the, a lot of the conversations I had were with like people that weren't there, the infamous shadow people. If you know, you know. But beings that were just non-existent. And on a level, I knew they weren't there, but I was just out of my mind enough that I was comfortable talking to them anyways. So, these things are pretty good indicators of unmanageability. And so if you take that as a guideline and say, like, well, how is my life unmanageable because of X? And you start to see some of these things arise, right? Like, and of course, drug use is a really extreme example. Things like, things like codependency might be less intense, and codependency, I would say, is the core of my addiction, and the process of addiction, which still affects me the most today, 15 years into recovery. And it can be a little more subtle, right? Like, my relationships are unmanageable. How is my life unmanageable because of them? I take things personally. I get disproportionately upset when things don't go my way, when people don't act the way I think they should. I can take things personally when people don't take my advice. Some, like, and when it was even more extreme, like, my esteem depended entirely on, well, not entirely, but largely on other people. And, of course, it's very healthy to get esteem boosts from others. But when I don't have the source of esteem coming from my own self, and some might say a higher power, although that's a whole other topic of can of worms that we won't get into now. But even just the connection to myself, if that's lacking, then it'll be unstable. Because truly the only person that can give me unconditional love or anything close to it is my own self, because other people are busy trying to live within their own self. So, my relationships, not as dramatic, but can be pretty dramatic. My relationship with pornography, like, unmanageable. Like, some of the things, like, when I use it, I start to see people as objects. Like, when I'm in the street, I have, like, a hard time not looking at women's bodies. And I don't like that. I don't want that for myself. I'm this person on a path, and I want to be free of all suffering, and I know that looking at women's bodies isn't satisfying in that way. Like, there's something beautiful about being with a romantic partner and everything else, like making a real connection with someone physically. That's wonderful. But just to be constantly pulled by that thirst to need to take it in through the eyes. That's unsettling and not satisfying, as far as I found. So my life gets unmanageable in subtler ways, but still very noticeable. Again, my relationship with food, that one is a little more subtle as well. But, slowly over time, my health will deteriorate if I'm eating cookies a lot. And there was a period, not long ago where I was ordering from Skip the Dishes just like 2 desserts at a time to get the free delivery. And there's days I did that twice in a day. I'd order like 2 chocolate brownies twice. And like overall, not like dramatic. I mean, like I didn't really have the money for it, but it wasn't like I wasn't missing the rent. Put on some weight at a time when I couldn't really afford to, but I didn't become unhealthily big again. But nonetheless, with some unmanageability. And what it really comes down to, the thing with this is like, this is all my stuff and it doesn't matter. Or at least it ought not matter. Because what matters is, have you suffered enough? Because that's what this is these things, like looking at these things for me, helped me to decide that I had had enough. And, truth be told, I've vacillated on that with most of these things, I've decided I've had enough and then thought, well, maybe I could have a little more. And hence the relapse process can come into play. But the point is that's what the purpose of this is to decide I've had enough. And then to, in the next steps, we decide to take some action. Because it will leave a void. Like the truth is that, one of the wisest things I heard was that like the addiction to the thing isn't the problem. It was in fact the solution. There's all that stuff underneath, all that pain, all that trauma of various sorts. And the word trauma might be a little loaded these days, but nonetheless, there's a lot of forms of trauma that are often missed. Things like neglect, like that just are often overlooked. I came from a family with a lot of material wealth, but there's other things missing. And that's not to throw any blame around. People were doing the best they could, but there were things missing, and it hurt. It had an effect. I felt empty. Because that emptiness, I found the solution in drugs, the solution in dating, the solution in romance and porn, and food, controlling other people. So once that solution, once I decided to let go of that solution, I needed a new solution. But this is really the foundation, of the 12 steps of starting to make a change according to this system. It's the bedrock of it, right? And it's often said that step 1 is the one you kind of need to do perfectly. Although I would still say that's a reach. You don't need to do it perfectly. But I would say, like, I know I needed to do it pretty well. I needed to be pretty on top of it. Because the fewer opportunities that I, was in a headspace that was like, oh, maybe I'll try some of this again. If I was in the wrong place at the wrong time, when it was still related to drugs, I would have been picking up and probably overdosing again, maybe dying this time. And some of the other things to consider about step 1 is like, how did I try to control my behavior? And because it might seem like I'm not out of control. It might seem like I'm not powerless. Or it might seem like you're not. And just ask yourself if you're able to control this. Can I control my drinking, using, drugging, porn use, relationships? And I know for me it was important to note that sometimes it felt like I could. There was times when I went out and had 2 beers and came home and I was like, yeah, see, no problem. But that would often set me up for the next time when I'd go out with that false confidence and end up in a jail cell or doing some things I really regretted, treating people poorly, just behavior I wasn't proud of. And that's one of the tricks of the mind. It's like, oh, no, look, it was fine because of this. It's like the gambler that only tells you about how much they win, but you never hear about how much they lost, right? So to wrap up here, that just to reiterate that The question is, what are my limits? Around step one, what are my limits? Is there unmanageability in my life because of this behavior? Do I have any control over it? And maybe just even considering, if there is still some, if you are still getting the payoff, because there is a payoff. There wouldn't have been this addiction if there was no payoff. But consider, like, is the payoff worth the consequences? And if it is, then you might just be all right. If there's no problem, there's no problem. But for those that are wondering here and feeling some feelings in your tummy, perhaps about like, oh shit, I might have some stuff to look at. It's worth looking at. Is the is the juice worth the squeeze? Is a somewhat strange saying that I quite enjoy. Anyways, till next time, may you be well.